If my grandma Emma could do that as a former slave in a one-room shack with 9 children as a widow, there's nothing women can't do. She was a womanist, and she didn't even know what that was. She was a feminist, and she didn't even know what that meant. But she asserted her right to be heard as a woman, as a wife, and as a mother. And I find that very inspirational. I regret that as a child I did not know this story. I regret that I only found this out in my 40s, but I'm also very grateful that I found it out at all, because my father died and didn't know. His father died and didn't know. You understand the gap in our history? So much has been lost that we have not been able to benefit from.
Good evening. Tonight, I stand before you as the proud great-great-great-granddaughter of an African who was enslaved in the United States of America until he summoned the courage to fight for his freedom. My grandpa, Sandy Wills, his story was lost from our family for 150 years until I logged on to the family research site Ancestry.com and uncovered records which revealed a story of bravery and dignity. Sandy was purchased on a slave auction block when he was a mere 10 years old, snatched from his mother, his father, and all the people he held dear, and transported to the Wills plantation in Haywood County, Tennessee. During his stay, he bonded with 5 enslaved boys, and 13 years later, they all escaped together to go fight for their freedom as members of the United States Colored Troops in the 4th Heavy Field Artillery, based out of Columbus, Kentucky. They fought and saw freedom at last in 1865. But the story did not end there. Although slavery had ended, its evil twin, Jim Crow, took its place. And my grandparents, also born in Haywood County, Tennessee, did not know, and Jim Crow taught them not to care about their African legacy.
Cheryl Wills speaking 2 years ago this week at the United Nations, joining us now to talk about the family history she uncovered in thousands of documents from the National Archives, especially the story of her great-great-great-grandparents, Sandy and Emma Wills. She details all of this in her book, Die Free, A Heroic Family Tale. Cheryl Wills is also well known in New York, an award-winning anchor and reporter for New York One, Time Warner Cable's flagship television news network. She was one of the founding staff of New York One and now a longtime anchor. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's a privilege to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
So, Cheryl, continue to tell us this remarkable story and how you discovered it.
You know, Amy, My family, for more than 100 years, had no idea who Sandy Wills was. And as I said in my speech to the United Nations, I found him online, which was remarkable. And it changed my life because this was a story that was empowering. It was nothing to be ashamed of. But during the Jim Crow era in the United States, many African Americans were taught to be ashamed of their legacy, to be ashamed of slavery, to be ashamed that they were forced here against their will. That's nothing to be ashamed of. It's actually a badge of honor that they survived. So when I found the records, I compiled it into a narrative, connecting it to my father, who passed away at a very young age. And I wrote the book, and it's been doing very well.
Now, when you say you went online and you discovered the story of your great-great-great-grandfather, what did you do?
I put in my father's last name. My father was a fireman who died in a horrific motorcycle accident. He was a fireman right here in New York City and a Vietnam-era paratrooper, and he died at 38. And when I was 13, I was like, who is this guy? So all I knew was that he was born in Haywood County, Tennessee. I put in his last name, Wills, and mine.
And you did this where online?
On Ancestry.com, can you believe? And I didn't even know what I was looking for. I just wanted some connection. You know, I'm still, no matter how old I get, I'm 46 years old, I'm still that little 13-year-old girl sitting at my father's funeral, no matter what I do in life. And I wanted to know more. Who was he? Who were his grandparents?
Why your last name was Wills?
Why was my last name Wills was the biggest question. And no one could ever answer that for me. And when I went online, I found out, when I got records from the National Archives, that Edmund Wills purchased little Sandy when he was 10 years old. Little Sandy was my great-great-great-grandfather.
And then how did you trace it from there?
Well, Sandy, it turns out, with 5 boys, bonded with them on the Wills plantation. He was purchased about 1850, and as they all grew up, those 5 boys, they realized they were in an oppressive situation. See, slavery was very demonic in all of its ways. It tried to make the slaves think they were in a special place, that we're taking care of you, and you should be so happy that you don't have to worry about the troubles of the world.
So he's given the name of his slave master.
As was customary. And what I found very remarkable was that all of these boys knew that they were being hoodwinked. They knew that there was something terribly wrong with the way they were living. And when they grew up and heard about the Emancipation Proclamation being signed by Abraham Lincoln in 1863, and that proclamation also authorized the enlistment of black soldiers and the formation of the United States Colored Troops, they knew it was their chance to escape.
USCT.
USCT. And when I saw that acronym next to Sandy's name, that's when I hired a professional genealogist. I said, I got to make sure this is right. I'm a journalist after all. I have to double and triple confirm this. And we did. And it turns out there was a definite link right from Sandy to his son Alex, to my great-grandpa Alan, to my grandfather Fred, to my father Clarence. So it turns out those boys together enlisted. They left.
They were all enslaved.
They were all the slaves of
all
Edmund
having
Wills.
The names of
all
Wills.
Had his surname, as was the tradition. And together they all left his plantation, crossed state lines into Columbus, Kentucky, enlisted as slaves in the 4th Heavy Field Artillery, and fought for their freedom from 1863, and they were all honorably discharged in 1866 after the Civil War. Only one of them died.
And what happened to Sandy then?
Sandy was honorably discharged, and like many slaves, he returned to the place that he knew, Haywood County, Tennessee. My father was born there, and he married a remarkable woman named Emma. They had 9 children, and they lived out the rest of their lives there.
This is Women's History Month, Cheryl, and your great-great-great-grandmother, Emma, certainly made history. Talk about what she did.
You know, Amy, thank you for saying that. And she was a soldier in her own right. Born a slave, sold twice in her life. First to the West family, then to the Moore family, and then the Civil War happened, and she found herself a free woman in 1865, and she was in her late teens. She marries this dashing Civil War veteran now named Sandy, my grandfather, 3 generations removed. They have 9 children. Here's what's interesting, one, that the history books don't tell you. She married in the home of the people who once owned her. I found that absolutely fascinating. I learned all of this from the pension records. She had a fancy wedding. and they paid for it, apparently. And someone
Well,
gave...
she really paid for it, right, with all those years of labor.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. But here's what's most interesting. Someone gave her a Bible. She was illiterate, as were most slaves. They were not allowed to read or write. In fact, they would cut off their hands or really whip them severely if they caught them even attempting to read a book. So she was illiterate. Someone gave her a Bible, presumably as a wedding gift. Every time she had a child, Amy, she had the people who once owned her write the name of her child in the Bible. Now, one might say, what a sophisticated thing for a 19-year-old former slave girl, now wife and mother, to do. She didn't do it once. She did it with all 9 of her children.
Because she wanted the date of their birth?
Absolutely.
She didn't know her own?
She didn't know her own. Isn't that something? She did not know when she came into the world. Neither did Sandy, neither did any former slave know. But she demanded that now that she is historic, as you said, in that she is the first in hundreds of years of enslaved African women to be able to have a child and keep it. She knew, my children will not be sold. These children are special. These are the first children in our area that we can keep who will not be sold on an auction block. So she had someone record their names and their birth dates, and it was a first, as you said. Here's what's interesting. Sandy dies about 15 years later. She's now a widow with 9 children. She appeals to the federal government for her widow's pension for herself and her 9 children. She has 9 dependents now.
Because he was a Civil War vet?
He was a Civil War veteran, and this was the beginning of the pension system for war veterans now. So she applies, and they immediately reject her, just without missing a beat. And she submitted his discharge paper. That was the one thing he kept when he was discharged. Even though he was illiterate, the sergeants told them, do not ever lose this discharge paper. And he kept it through his marriage, living in a one-room shack, formerly a slave shack, now a sharecropper's shack. So she had it. She submitted it to the federal government, the War Pension Department. They rejected her. What did she do? She hired a lawyer in the 1880s. That's very impressive. At $10 per filing, her lawyer's name was C.M. Sweet. I have all the documents. They sent them to me. I paid for it by page, Amy. It was the best investment I ever made. Because in these documents, I see how they gave her the runaround. I see how they did not respect her as a widow, as someone whose husband sacrificed his life to help end the scourge of slavery in the United States. They could care less. They asked her all kinds of demeaning questions. Provide proof of your birth. They knew she was unable to do so. Provide proof of Sandy's birth. They knew she was unable to do so. And then they hit her with what I call the jackpot question. Provide proof that Sandy's children were in fact born and legally yours, and provide proof of their birth. And she gave her lawyer that Bible that she couldn't even read for herself. But she said to her lawyer, it's in here, get it. I had the people who once owned me write their names and birth dates in the Bible. And she said, they wrote, quote, I know my Bible record is right. And it was the most touching thing I had ever seen. And what was even more heart-wrenching was at the end of every document, you see everyone else's beautiful cursive script, and they're transcribing her deposition, and she's going over and over, I married Sandy, and, you know, trying to prove her existence in the United States. And at the end of the document, Amy, you see she signs it with an X.
And she got her...
She won. They went back and forth, and the government humiliated her and asked her demeaning questions, but she did not give up. If my grandma Emma could do that as a former slave in a one-room shack with 9 children as a widow, there's nothing women can't do. She was a womanist, and she didn't even know what that was. She was a feminist, and she didn't even know what that meant. But she asserted her right to be heard as a woman, as a wife, and as a mother. And I find that very inspirational. I regret that as a child I did not know this story. I regret that I only found this out in my 40s, but I'm also very grateful that I found it out at all, because my father died and didn't know. His father died and didn't know. You understand the gap in our history? So much has been lost that we have not been able to benefit from.
You've been listening to the remarkable Cheryl Wills, author of Die Free, A Heroic Family Tale.